The Special Forces team must have been in shock when they were given the target details. The site they were tasked with hitting was codenamed Deep Layer. Deep Layer was located deep in the mountains near the town of Masyaf, 124 miles north of the Israeli border and 28 miles inland from the Mediterranean coast. It's considered the second most densely concentrated air defense zone in all of Syria. The facility is built in a broad horseshoe shape and dug into the earth between 200 and 400 feet under the mountain. Even if you reach Deep Layer, it's made of reinforced concrete with heavy blast doors and 16 compartmentalized rooms for missile production and storage. On the outside were heavily armed guards. Further complicating matters, the location was in close proximity to the Russian naval base at Tartus to dissuade any airstrikes against it. If an airstrike missed, it could hit Russian forces and cause an international SNAFU. Israeli military planners decided the only way to destroy the missile base would be to send in a team of commandos in a high-risk ground assault, unlike anything we've seen in recent history. This video contains the actual footage from that raid.
But before we go any further, I want to tell you about the folks that made this video possible, Navy Mutual. Navy Mutual provides affordable life insurance to active duty service members, reservists, National Guard members, and retirees. Navy Mutual was founded by military members and is still run by a staff of veterans, military spouses, and others close to the military community, so they know how to serve those who've served. And since they're a nonprofit, you know that you're going to get an affordable price and to talk to someone who has no other mission than to provide you with the best possible plan. Navy Mutual not only insures service members, but has no restrictions around deployments, special operations, or aviation. They'll also give you unbiased advice on programs like SGLI, VGLI, and Survivor's Benefit Plan, and other military and veteran benefits. Check out more by visiting NavyMutual.org today.
Military intelligence first noticed construction of the missile production facility in 2017. The facility was funded by Iran and built by Syria's infamous Scientific Studies and Research Center, or SSRC. The SSRC is responsible for developing Syria's chemical weapons program and has been sanctioned by the US government. It produced precision missiles and rockets that were smuggled over the border to Lebanon to reinforce Hezbollah. Transporting rockets and missiles from Iran has become more difficult in recent years due to Israeli airstrikes and US military interdiction, so they hope to cut out the long transport route and just produce the missiles closer to Hezbollah. Mass production would have the estimated capacity between 100 and 300 advanced missiles produced each year, but the factory had been expanded to produce long-range drones only recently. For the mission, commanders tapped into the Israeli Air Force special operators from Units 5101, also known as Kingfisher, and Unit 669, nicknamed Flying Cats. They're similar to the Israeli version of the Air Force pararescuemen, elite combat medics trained to evacuate and treat personnel from helicopter raids. The teams trained together for 2 months straight to think of anything that could possibly go wrong with the entire mission, from the helicopters to the actual raid. They even specially got forklift certified for the mission, but I won't spoil the reason why just yet. On the night of September 8th, 2024, it was go time for Operation Many Ways. 100 commandos and 20 combat medics boarded 4 CH-53 Sea Stallion heavy lift helicopters. Escorting the transport choppers was an insane amount of backup. It included 2 Apache attack helicopters that would also provide direct fire support once the troops landed. Then there was 21 fighter jets and 14 recon aircraft, along with 5 drones to support the operation. It didn't end there. It also included vessels from the Israeli Navy, and another 30 aircraft were on standby in case the operation went south and ran into trouble. The mission was definitely going to be controversial because it not only violated Syrian airspace, but it would also see Israeli boots on the ground inside Syria during one of the most sensitive times in recent history. The choppers took a route over the Mediterranean Sea and around Lebanon before turning east to the cross into Syria along the coastline. The pilots flew extremely low, just a few feet off the deck, to avoid detection by the Syrian and Russian air defense that was located in the area. As the assault team approached the coastline, the other aircraft and naval vessels assigned to the operation started hammering targets all over western Syria, sowing chaos and diverting attention away from the mission's mission's true objective. Once the transport choppers crossed into Syrian airspace, it had only taken them 18 minutes to reach the missile factory. When they touched down on the ground, there were no signs that they'd been detected on the way in. They caught the guards completely by surprise, and the element of surprise in something like this is extremely important. The operators split into 3 teams, while the medics stayed with the choppers just in case the teams took any casualties. The first team fanned out, secured the landing site to create a kind of cordon around the facility, while the second team stormed the entrance. They took out 2 guards on the way in, and then the third team secured a nearby hilltop to get the high ground, and they deployed a small drone from there that could monitor the area and engage hostiles if needed. Then the operation hit its first snag just after landing. Even though they hadn't been detected on the way in, all the distraction fire meant that the Syrian military personnel were on high alert, and they were on the move to regroup at any base that they could reach as quickly as possible, either because it was the nearest military base or because someone inside the missile factory had radioed for help. Dozens of Syrian soldiers were now moving towards that facility. Then they hit their second snag to make matters worse. The heavy blast doors at the entrance were sealed, and it would take almost an hour for the entry team to cut their way through. They called in aircraft overhead, though, to be diverted on a special bombing run. The commandos requested close air support if the air power could be directed to bomb the roads and the narrow mountain passes that led to the facility they were at. Then they could possibly delay those Syrian reinforcements and stop them from reaching the site while they were vulnerable and outnumbered. Meanwhile, the entry team worked on cutting the doors open. Once they were past the first set of doors, though, they realized there was a second set of metal doors still in their way. Just then, explosions shook the ground. The air support had blown the routes leading to them, buying these troops some extra time. This is where the forklift certification that I mentioned earlier comes into play. Intelligence reports had indicated that the factory kept a few forklifts in the entry chamber, so the Israeli operators used those on-site forklifts to lift the second set of metal blast doors so that they could scoot underneath it and make their way into the tunnels. Once the facility had been breached, the assault teams cleared the hallways and chambers of about 30 enemy guards, taking them out as they advanced forward. Then demolition experts raced around and secured areas on a quad bike that they brought on board the CH-53, and they went around planting charges throughout the complex like a scene straight out of GTA. Just them on ATVs slapping charges on the wall. The commandos rigged up 660 pounds worth of explosives, and they rigged it straight to remote detonators. They did a quick tactical site exploitation, grabbing intelligence from the underground facility and taking photos showing specialized mixers used for casting solid rocket motors, and then a couple of shots of the partially assembled weapons. The team rallied back outside the factory and boarded up on the helicopters safely. As they took off, they set off the charges, creating just a massive explosion. I mean, imagine the combined force of the demo charges along with the huge amounts of rocket fuel and warheads already inside the factory just completely demolished the facility from the inside out, and the explosion could be felt from miles away. From the Israeli point of view, Operation Many Ways was a success. They'd eliminated a major military production facility, arming missiles on their northern border within 2.5 hours with 0 losses, despite facing heavy air defense and enemy forces on the target area. But why would Israel take a risk like this now? Is it part of some broader strategy? So on that strategic scale, the operation, I think, was a message to Iran. They wanted to send a signal that they had many ways of attacking Iran's proxies, even while they were preoccupied with wars in Gaza and Lebanon. The mission was kept secret for months until reporters from the New York Times caught wind of it through Western officials that had been briefed on the raid, which makes me think that this was purposefully released at this time. So they had some reason for letting people know that they did this, because it wasn't until January 2nd, just after New Year's on 2025, that the Israeli government officially acknowledged the operation and declassified all these details that we just went through. Roughly a month after the Syrian president al-Assad fell, and roughly a month after the IDF started their incursions into the Golan Heights. So the raid took place before the rebel offensive that deposed Assad. But what I think is interesting about the timing of all of this is that after the fall of Assad's government forces, Israeli forces, including tanks and other heavy weapons, breached a UN-mandated buffer zone in the Golan Heights, capturing over 500 square kilometers of Syrian territory. Whether it was a success tactically for Israel or not, on the diplomatic side, this helicopter raid and then ground assault happening and being released in close period of time brought international criticism. So it's true that Israel has occupied and annexed a portion of the Golan Heights since gaining military control of the strategic plateau during the 1967 Six-Day War. After signing a ceasefire agreement in 1974, Israel agreed to this demilitarized buffer zone between them and Syria, which was overseen by the newly created UN Disengagement Observer Force. The so-called Purple Line, supervised by the UN, was supposed to ease tensions between Israel and Syria. Yet the IDF's move in December, immediately following the collapse of the Syrian government, go way beyond anything since the signing of the UN DOF agreement in 1974. The Israeli government asserts that because the government that co-signed the ceasefire doesn't even exist anymore, the document is null and void, especially after former Syrian soldiers abandoned their post once they realized that boss wasn't in charge anymore. Critics of Israel's actions have called it an outright invasion of Syria, with massive numbers of troops, vehicles, and aircraft pouring through the UN-established Purple Line and seizing hundreds of miles of territory. The IDF troops advanced all the way to Mount Hermon on December 17th, capturing the peak of the tallest mountain in Syria, which also overlooks the capital city of Damascus. According to open source reporting, 2 brigades, or roughly 10,000 troops, have crossed over the Purple Line since December, with promises of many more to come in recent statements from Israeli officials. Along the ground offensive, Israeli Air Force began a massive air campaign against former Syrian military assets. By mid-December, Israeli fighters had struck over 500 targets across the country, claiming to have destroyed 90% of the ex-Assad regime's air defense systems. The IAF, or the Israeli Air Force, also completely destroyed what was left of the Syrian Navy. Besides ships and air defenses, the targets for these strikes were also known weapon stockpiles, including mustard and nerve gas reserves, missile launchers, parked aircraft or helicopters, and army motor pools. The reason for all this destruction? To stop those weapons from falling into terrorist hands, according to the IDF's justifications. In fact, Turkish news sources reported it was President Assad himself that shared the locations of these classified stockpiles with Israel in exchange for safe passage out of the country. Now, do I know for a fact if any of that is true or not? No. Now, we don't know for a fact if any of that is true or not, but in the uneasy aftermath of the rebel offensive that deposed President Assad, Israel has voiced its concern that the Syrian territory will become a safe haven for ISIS and other international terror groups if there isn't a strong presence to block them. Author and former Deputy Communications Director for the Prime Minister Office, Michael Freund, believes Israel should be that strong presence. He advocates in an article in the Jerusalem Post that the captured territories should be annexed. He says, quote, "The new foothold also provides Israel with a panoramic observation point from which it can closely monitor Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, which has also long served as a Hezbollah stronghold, amid the chaos now prevailing in Syria, where a former Al-Qaeda affiliate has assumed power. The existential need for the Jewish state to retain Hermon has never been clearer, a sentiment shared by a consensus of Israelis. But as you might imagine, the offensive in the air campaign has stirred up a hornet's nest of controversy in the international community. Turkey already severed diplomatic relations with Israel this past November in protest of Israel's conduct in the Gaza war. Turkey is also another major player in the Syrian territory, bordering the country to the north, and with direct ties to multiple rebel groups that have helped overthrow the Assad regime. So these power plays from both nations to exert more control over Syria could bring them into direct confrontation as Turkey moves south while Israel moves north. Other international groups warn that Israel's using the pretext of security concerns as a deflection from just a plain old-fashioned land grab. They point to the fact that the Israeli government has already approved plans to bring in even more settlers to the occupied Golan Heights just days after crossing the Purple Line. Regional analysts also argue that Israel's actions might actually backfire, worsening the power vacuum in Syria by preventing a stable government from forming and risking Libyan-style post-Civil War chaos. Amidst all these discussions, Israel then drops the news about the raid back in September, arguing that the raid is evidence both of an urgent need to act decisively against asymmetric threats emanating from Syria, as well as a textbook demonstration of Israel's ability to project power war into Syria unchallenged. Israel claims that they have a clear stake in what happens in Syria now that Assad's government has fallen. High-level talks within the Israeli government have been leaked, deliberating if the best thing to do might be to divide Syria into multiple districts along ethnic boundaries, while the issue would be decided during an international summit. The fact that it was Israel that suggested it might cause Syria to reject it outright. Turkey would also likely oppose the idea since it would offer protection for the PKK, or the Kurdish militias that Turkey has branded as terror groups. For now, Israel's public statements are emphasizing that they intend the military occupation of southern Syria to be a temporary measure. After almost 2 months since the fall of Assad and the end of the Syrian civil war, what happens next in the territory is one of the biggest unknowns of 2025. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Thank you for watching. Please remember to check out Pepperbox TV if you want to see an uncensored combat rundown weekly that we do an exclusive show on there that I think you might be interested in. Signing off this net time now.